A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the second reading today, St. Paul describes Christ crucified as a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The Jewish community at the time had vastly different expectations for when the Messiah was to come. You see, they were expecting a great military leader who would work great miracles to prove God's presence. In effect, they wanted to base their faith on things that their senses could perceive. But in doing so, they had placed limits on how God can reveal himself. The Greeks, for their part, thought that they were the arbiters of truth and that everything was nonsense if it couldn't be proved by logical arguments. They too began placing limits on God's revelation of himself. But for both of these parties, by placing these limits on God's revelation, they effectively blinded themselves to God's reality. So this is what St. Paul is talking about when he says that Christ crucified is a stumbling block and foolishness to the people of his time. But what about the people of our time? It seems that for many, Christ crucified is still a stumbling block, but perhaps for very different reasons. I'm speaking specifically of the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the three things necessary for Christian perfection. Especially here in the United States, poverty, which is a good, is derided in our materialistic and capitalistic society. Chastity is looked down upon more so today than it has been in ages past. We're constantly told by the world around us that hookup culture is a good thing, and the celibate, the chaste person, is looked down upon as an oddity. And obedience to God's law and the authorities he has appointed over us is rejected as a limitation on people's freedom. These evangelical counsels, though, are mandatory for religious life, but even for the diocesan priest, they are guiding principles. And for the young man or woman who might be called to this life of sacrifice to these vocations, these counsels are often seen as foolishness and stumbling blocks because of the society that these young men and women come from, our society. For those discerning religious life, for the young man discerning the diocesan priesthood, then, it's imperative to come to a proper understanding of these counsels in order to reject the false perception of them imposed by society. Poverty, by uprooting distorted love for wealth, sets the heart free to reach out to God and heavenly things. Chastity, by spurning the pleasures of the flesh, even those the holy state of marriage would sanction, fosters an undivided love of God. Obedience, by fighting pride and the spirit of independence, subjects the will to that of God. This poverty, this chastity, this obedience is, in reality, a genuine act of love. And it's only through these counsels that we can move towards the perfection that Christ has called us to. These counsels have been a stumbling block for discerners for quite some time, and likely will continue to be so for some time more, but they needn't be. My brothers and sisters, Christ has turned the world on its head, and if we wish to overcome these stumbling blocks and pursue our vocation, whether it be to marriage, religious life, or the priesthood, we too must upend our own understanding of what is good and perfect and look at everything through the lens of the gospel.